Daddy, Mommy get sometimes angry. Boo, 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 boo. 1, 2, 3, they throw my toys away. Boo, 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 boo. Done.
Welcome back to Fourth Culture Studios. It's time again to throw your toys away. Today, we're sponsored by death. May we resist your ever-present burden. To do that, we are going to start with a beginning by lessing from his Laocoon. Okay. The first person to compare painting with poetry was a man of fine feeling, who observed that both arts produce a similar effect on him. Both, he felt, represent absent things as being present and appearance as reality. Both create an illusion, and in both cases, the illusion is pleasing. A second observer, in attempting to get at the nature of this pleasure, discovered that both proceed from the same source, beauty, a concept which we first derive from physical objects, has general rules applicable to a number of things, to actions and thoughts as well as forms. A third, who examined the value and distribution of these general rules, observed that some of them are more predominant in painting, others in poetry. Thus, in the one case, poetry can help to explain and illustrate painting, and in the other, painting can do the same for poetry. The first was the amateur, the second was the philosopher, and the third was the critic. We're not going to dive into some of the issues that Lessing brings up here in his preface and then continues to explore throughout his text. Hopefully we'll get to some of that stuff later on and see its insight and some of its problematic character. But rather, I read it just for its basic comparison between painting and poetry. For me, starting out as an English major and then moving over to the art department later, I always had these two things kind of, in my mind simultaneously. An interest in literature and poetry, and then also an interest in images. I like the way that he starts off with noting that both of them are creating illusions. And certainly that's true for all works of art. Today we're going to be dealing largely with the reading of a work of art. But before we get there, I want to read a poem by Walt Whitman. This is a poem that I happened to come across when I was 40 years old. And I had just gotten a residency and commission with the city of Louisville. And here's the painting that I completed that came out of that residency. But I went to Louisville for 3 weeks, and I went to, some of the festivals that lead up to the horse races, so Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby. And as my first major kind of public art commission, this poem really spoke to me. So let's just get into it. Full of life, now, compact, visible. I, 40 years old, the 83rd year of the States, to one a century hence, or any number of centuries hence, to you, yet unborn, these, seeking you. When you read these, I, that was visible, and become invisible. Now it is you, compact, visible, realizing my poems, seeking me, fancying how happy you were, if I could be with you and become your comrade. Be it as if I were with you. Be not too certain, but I am now with you. At the time, it had a nice kind of parody to it. It's like thinking about Walt Whitman as a 40-year-old man and being a 40-year-old man at the time, this span of years between the two of us, the way that the work of art becomes the bridge for that span, the way that he, as the artist, then is reaching out toward me and addressing me directly, and then me on this side, finding the poem by accident as it traveled through its destiny in time, into a volume that found its way from someone's shelf into a used bookstore, and then me wandering through Sam Weller's books in Utah, which I'm not sure if it's still there. But they just have a whole back room where it was 20 feet, floor-to-ceiling books. You feel like you're entering a kind of catacomb. You could feel the temperature shift as you went from the main bookstore back into that back room. And then having the book for 20 years before reading that poem. It was an intense experience, really, for me. And it's still, I find that poetry and artworks in general have a way of starting to point to and open up, a kind of space. We might call it an epiphany. Today we're going to read some selections from the Verbal Icon, specifically the chapter titled The Intentional Fallacy. We're not going to read the whole thing. We're just going to go through and take its key points. But first, let's drink some tea. Today, we are going to be drinking this High Mountain Oolong, which is one of my favorite teas. But this is the last package, and we are going to open it up today, and we're going to test it out. Can observe the tea. So you can see this oolong is very dark, and the way that they make the oolong is they'll take the leaves and then they roast the leaves, and then they put them in a large pan, roast the leaves, and then they put them in another kind of machine there where they roll the leaves into these little balls. So we can take a look, and then as you steep the tea, then the little nuggets will unfurl, and then you'll see the leaves. And this tea is a two-hearted tea, so it'll have, the sprout and then two leaves. All right. And you always observe your tea, and then smell your tea. But now we wait. All right. You can hear the tea as the water is ready. I've got a timer. The first thing you'll do is rinse the tea. Wash any dust. Allow the leaves to start to wake up. That's a super short thing. People have all different recommendations for times. I think in the end, just find the time that makes the tea that you like to drink. I, over the years, have started to drink stronger and stronger tea. But we're going to stop at 26 seconds. I always go for about 1.5 minutes on the first steeping of this tea. And then over the years, with my garage style Gung Fu tea making, typically the thing that I do is just forget. I'll pour the tea in, and then I won't be patient enough. I'll go to do something else. I'll come back, and it'll have been 20 minutes, and then the tea is super strong, and I will drink it anyway. And I've really grown to love like very strong tea, especially with, an oolong. So when you drink with the 2 cups, first you'll pour it into this cup, the taller one, and roll the cup just to feel the warmth, and then smell the tea. So this cup is just to carry the smell, the scent. Okay. It's great. Really roasty, floral. It's good tea. Let's have some more. All right, that's one of my favorite teas. So it's only going to last for about 3 or 4 weeks. So if you want some, then let me know soon, and I will ship it out to you, and then we can drink some of that tea together. But let's get into it. So, The Intentional Fallacy by Wimsatt and Beardsley. They're talking about critique, the critique of poetry specifically, but I think that it crosses directly over to the critique of art in a larger sense. And largely what I want to draw out of this is basically, they've got these 5 axioms, and they lay them out point by point in the beginning of the article. The first one is that a poem or a work of art does not happen by accident. Not much to argue with there. Number 2, intention, or whatever motivated the artist to make the work, must be in the work if the critic is able to draw out that intention from the work. That's a key point. They say it better than I do. The third one, I think I just activated my phone over there. The third one is that the poem or the work of art must work. So that's talking a lot about economy. They say a poem should mean, they say a poem should not mean but be, and I think that that's a nice turn of phrase that just talks about the way that works of art begin to embody, the content through their form. Come in. What are you doing? Oh, thank you.
Experiment.
Oh, great. What kind of experiment?
Should try it.
It's so good.
Do you want some tea?
No, I'm okay. Are you filming?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. What is this? Tell me what it is. Tell me what it is.
It's a coffee, but this is my first time make the milk foamy.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's not too sugary. I just add just a little bit sugar and I put a chocolate on top.
Oh, it looks like powdered chocolate on top. Did you have some?
She had the top one, the foamy part. Come on, the
Oh,
foamy
okay.
part, we're gonna
Okay.
taste it. The coffee is not that strong, just a little bit coffee.
Oh, the chocolate's really bitter. Is there salt there too? That's the salt. You want me to just drink it down and give you the cup?
Yeah. I just give you a little bit of taste. It's my first time successful to make the milk really foamy.
Oh, it's really good.
Right.
It was fun to drink.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I thought.
Okay, where were we? Oh, it must work. Actually, that's like the perfect intervention because one of the things that they use as an image when they're talking about how a poem must work is they compare it to a pudding. So we'll get there. The fourth is something that I think is very intense, but they talk about soul and how the soul of a work, how I think about any particular artist. So we'll get there. This is getting awkward. And then the fifth one is about vision. So let's jump in. Axiom number 1. A poem does not come into existence by accident. The words of a poem, as Professor Stoll has remarked, come out of a head, not out of a hat. Yet, to insist on the designing intellect as a cause of a poem is not to grant the design or intention as a standard by which the critic is to judge the worth of a poet's performance. So we're just trying to separate the criteria for judgment from the motivation of the artist, the intention. Point number 2. One must ask how a critic expects to get an answer to the question about intention. How is he to find out what the poet tried to do? If the poet succeeded in doing it, then the poem itself shows what he was trying to do. If the poem did not succeed, then the poem is not adequate evidence, and the critic must go outside the poem for evidence of an intention that did not become effective in the poem. Only one caveat must be borne in mind, says the eminent intentionalist, in a moment when his theory repudiates itself. The poet's aim must be judged at the moment of the creative act, that is to say, by the art of the poem itself. For there to be a logical reading of a work, then the critic must be basing their reasoned argument, their rational statements, on evidence that they're finding in the poem itself, or in the work of art itself. Point 3. Judging a poem is like judging a pudding or a machine. One demands that it work. It is only because an artifact works that we infer the intention of the artificer. A poem should not mean, but be. A poem can only be through its meaning. Since its medium is words, yet it is, simply is, in the sense that we have no excuse for inquiring what part is intended or meant. Poetry is a feat of style by which a complex of meaning is handled all at once. Poetry succeeds because all or most of what is said or implied is relevant. What is irrelevant has been excluded, like lumps from pudding and bugs from machinery. Poetry is a feat of style by which a complex of meaning is handled all at once. That word style, I think, can be tricky for young artists in a similar way to that big A art being in the act of creation itself. Just as a way that we might actually be putting roadblocks in front of our own creative discovery or in front of our own potential, where we set a particular kind of parameter that we can see from the outset and then we work up toward it, rather than setting a parameter that allows us to move up to the parameter, but then also like move beyond it. I like to put style at the end of the artist's life or at the end of the artist's career and see it as, in a way, it's like the thing that is left when everything else has been burnt away, whether that's been burnt away by tragedy through just, 50, maybe that's too much, 20, 30 years of intense studio work, where they're continuing to search and distill, finding and building into their work that kind of economy. Or perhaps it's through inattention and things begin to fall away and all that you have left is the thing that will continue to drive someone to make in the long run. So if I think about style, largely I think about the artists whose names perhaps have been reduced down to their last name. So Picasso, Pollock, Caravaggio. Their name has become a stand-in for their work, their individuality, their personhood, their everydayness has dropped away, and what's left is the work. And Wimsatt and Beardsley will have a little bit more to say about that, I think, in point number 4. So point number 4. The meaning of a poem may certainly be a personal one, in the sense that a poem expresses a personality or a state of soul rather than a physical object like an apple. But even a short lyric poem is dramatic, the response of a speaker, no matter how abstractly conceived, to a situation, no matter how universalized. We ought to impute the thoughts and attitudes of the poem immediately to the dramatic speaker, and, if to the author at all, only by the act of biographical inference. So I find that to be, a really intense claim, and the separation that they're putting into the work of art. A poem expresses a personality or state of soul rather than a physical object like an apple. All right, we ought to impute the thoughts and attitudes of the poem immediately to the dramatic speaker, and if to the author at all, only by an act of biographical inference. So they're claiming or trying to establish a separation between the voice of the poet from the voice of the individual. That voice of the poet is embedded in the poem itself and comes through in the act of reading the poem or the act of engaging with the work of art. So we're trying to establish and see the difference between the personhood of the artist and the work of art. Yes, but what about works of art that make the personhood of the artist the work of art? This is something entirely separate. It's a separate concern. It does draw the boundary in a different place, but that boundary is a parameter that's set upon the work of art by the artist, and thereby they become included, encapsulated into the work. So I don't think that it actually shifts it. Lately, I find the musician Charles Bradley and, some of his songs sung on YouTube to just be a powerful encapsulation of a sense of soul. I want us all to stop this video. I'll put a link to some Charles Bradley, maybe just one, but let's take a pause and listen to a Charles Bradley song while I get to drink more tea.
Thanks for coming back.
Welcome back to Fourth Culture Studios. Wow. Charles Bradley is an amazing, not just the words, he says, but I couldn't get away no matter how far I went to. Looks like nothing's going to change. Certainly poetry, but then just the embodiment of that in, his voice, his intensity. Sometimes I just get stuck on a song, and I'll play it on a loop in the studio. And since I'm spending hours in the studio, then it starts to just become a kind of like tone or ambiance, and I've just found recently that Charles Bradley really, captures a particular kind of state of soul, a state of meaning, state of embodiment of the poetry of the work that I find incredibly moving. But to extend that sense, it's like to allow for the work itself to be this kind of like container of content, where certainly it takes like the viewer to come and activate the content, but the sense in which, there is something that is like embedded there in that material, that arrangement of notes, that arrangement of words, that arrangement of light shapes and shade shapes, the way that it activates, I guess what I want to talk about is the kind of like resonant tension of bringing together these disparate forms. The way that it takes us there. I might start to think about, that note, that through the looking glass moment, or over the rainbow, the yellow brick road. It's like, it seemed like a real place. This great moment in The Wizard of Oz when she's back in Kansas, back in her bed, and she wakes up and all of her friends, all of her family are there, and she's just so stunned. It's like that realization of the truth in the dream, the way that artworks become portals to the dream space of the maker. Now, what we're talking about here is for that dream space to be fully activated, then the maker has to do something to get it into the work. What I think is really crucial is the sentence, "We ought to impute the thoughts and attitudes of the poem immediately to the dramatic speaker, and if to the author at all, only by the act of biographical inference." So there's a dramatic cut that they're trying to establish between the voice of the work, which is embedded in the work, and then the voice of, the individual. These things, certainly they're related. They're saying only by an act of biographical inference. I think that this is giving like a kind of independent life to the work of art that I think is appropriate, and I think it's appropriate and revealed even by the way that we refer to those masterworks. They end up just being referred to by their last name. I like to think of it as a kind of like gravity, where the work itself starts to generate so much gravity that other things start to become, start to orbit that work. So the way that one artist might make some kind of like breakthrough in their chosen medium, a breakthrough in painting, Cézanne, let's say, Van Gogh, let's say. And then the way that I can start to see that influence, I can see that tug, on the work of other artists. One thing that I like to do is I make that image, the image of an artist's work taking on, the heat, the power, the intensity, the weight of the sun, the way that that's shedding light on all of those orbiting bodies. If we take the idea of space itself as a kind of chunk, I always see like the representation of space as a kind of plane, and then they're talking about the way that gravity or very heavy objects will actually distort the space itself. So if I was to take that plane of space, and it's all three dimensions, and then flip it upside down, right? Instead of that funneling effect, then what we would see is a spire, And so I like to think of the artist, the artists who we attribute style to, the artists who have soul in their work, they become those pillars on the landscape. And I also like to flip that gravity around, to turn space itself upside down, so that rather than being pulled into the vortex of those artists' influence, I can ride the banks of their style on my skateboard. Okay. Okay. Number 5. There is a sense in which an author, by revision, may better achieve his original intention. But it is a very abstract sense. He intended to write a better work or a better work of a certain kind and now has done it, but it follows that his former concrete intention was not his intention. He's the man we are in search of, that's true, says Hardy's rustic constable. And yet he's not the man we are in search of, for the man we are in search of was not the man we wanted. I think for me, this is just a crucial point for artists, and especially for young makers, right? Where it's like the thing that gets me started, my initial intention, may be abandoned as the work starts to come into fruition. And to recognize that I can use the work as an act of creation, that I can find something in the making of the work that I couldn't necessarily preconceive of from the outset. That there are horizons that I can see by the time I get to the middle or the end of a work that I couldn't see from the beginning. Let's continue. Is not a critic, asked Professor Stoll, a judge who does not explore his own consciousness, but determines the author's meaning or intention, as if the poem were a will, a contract, or a constitution? The poem is not the critic's own. He, Professor Stoll, has accurately diagnosed 2 forms of irresponsibility, one of which he prefers. Our view is yet different. The poem is not the critic's own and not the author's. It is detached from the author at birth and goes about the world beyond his power to intend about it or control it. The poem belongs to the public. It is embodied in language, the peculiar possession of the public, and it is about the human being, an object of public knowledge. What is said about the poem is subject to the same scrutiny as any statement in linguistics or in the general science of psychology. Basically, works of art are discursive. The meaning of works of art are found in the works themselves and understood through discursive context. That might be the discursive context of a singular viewer, me standing in front of a work of art, where I'm thinking to myself and contemplating the meaning that I find there. Or, if I bring someone along, we can talk to each other about the work. So the loop, is completed. The way that Whitman's poem is looking for a reader. And then that comradeship is found only when that reader reads the poem. But Whitman is also a reader of his own poetry and can also jump into the fray, into that discursive context, and talk about the meaning of his poems. What is being purported here is that the artist, in describing or making a critical reading of their own work, is on the same plane as the other critic. So they still have to make a logical reading of the work, and a logical reading of the work requires that the evidence be in the work itself. That's how I understand, their key points, their key arguments. So if I was to make that into a diagram, which I've conveniently already done, then we would separate the work from the artist. I've crossed out artist and put maker to make it more broad. We've separated the maker from the critic. We've separated the critic from the work. And so we're in this triad where these things can move back and forth and occupy the space of the other label. But as makers, we want to allow for there to be like a clear separation, and I think that that's kind of a crucial point. And one of the big takeaways for me from this article, and actually we're going to get into a little bit of advice to makers, in the next section of the chapter. But If when I'm making, I can quiet that critical voice, at least in the moment of creation itself, so that I can fully, to the best of my ability, embody the processes that I have laid out, and it's like those processes become the parameters through which the work will emerge. So as a maker, I want to set the critique aside so that I'm not simultaneously trying to embody the process and embody that judgment, so that it is out. Then when I make a judgment, so I pause. If I'm making a drawing, and let's say I'm drawing from life, and I've got my subject and it's set up in front of me, and then I'm back here behind my drawing board, I want to, in that moment, let go of where I think the drawing is going to go, and really just engage my subject and engage a drawing process that I've adopted. So if I think that I'm laying out a key and using point vector to help me define the proportions, then I want to really just try and think about one angle at a time. Can I get that first angle, recognizing that the work of art relies on me building over time the relationship between, all of those visual qualities, the proportions of the thing, the positive and the negative, the light and the shade. I do want to step back and take a look at the work. Look at the work, look at my drawing, compare the two. What do I see that's similar? What do I see that's different? What's jumping out at me? What do I want to change? I like to try and organize processes around that critique. I think we'll probably get into those later on someday. And then organize processes around making. But keep those things separate so that I don't have to try and do everything at once. And also to see the work as separate from myself too. It's interesting if we reflect back on point 4 and how radical that really becomes, where it really is a intense separation between the soul of the work and then me as an individual, where I think it puts the work into a proper kind of distance from the artist. I often get really nervous when people have a conflation of these two things, because if the work is taking on really intense topics, let's say a horror film, or let's say murder or violence. I don't want to have to be confronted with that violence or having to attribute that violence to the artist, but rather I want to see the work of art as intellectual investigation into those forms. So into the form of horror, which might be taking on, our friend and sponsor, the confrontation of our own mortality, rather than seeing, that work as, the expression of the person's true self. It's like there can be a difference between who someone is and their intellectual interest. So I want to separate work from maker, maker from critic, critic from work. All right, let's get to the fun part. And for me, the fun part is like, once we've divorced the artist from the work and the artist from the critic, I really like some of the advice that they give. But it starts out with, extending some of this notion of the successful work of art. And they mention Ananda K. Coomaraswamy, who I've got a great article on, a kind of scientific take on embodiment in works of art that I think is really interesting, that I'd like to maybe take on, a few weeks from now or down the road sometime. But anyway, it says, Ananda K. Coomaraswamy has argued that there are two kinds of inquiry about a work of art. Number one, whether the artist achieved their intentions. Number two, whether the work of art ought ever to have been taken up at all, and so whether it is worth preserving. I think that this actually extends the kind of discussion that I was starting to touch on, where just in seeing the artist as separate from the work itself, then we can see that the work is an intellectual pursuit, and that intellectual pursuits imply an ethic, imply a morality. But that kind of ought is not the main thrust of the article. So number one, we've been taking that on, intentions, how they relate to content, and then how they relate to the reading of a work of art. Number two, whether the work of art should have been taken up at all, and whether it is worth preserving. This becomes, I think, a question of morality in the work of art, ethics in the work of art, and that question, while alluded to, is not the main thrust of the chapter, and so we're going to hold it in abeyance as well. Interesting question, important question, but we're going to move forward. They also mention Goethe. Goethe's 3 questions for constructive criticism are: what did the author set out to do? Was his plan reasonable and sensible? And how far did he succeed in carrying it out? Then they jump and they say that the poets have had something to say that the critic and professor could not say. Their message has been more exciting, that poetry should come as naturally as leaves to a tree, that poetry is the lava of the imagination, or that it is emotion recollected in tranquility. But it is necessary that we realize that the character and authority of such a testimony. To me, that sounds very much like artists are trying to inhabit and exist in a state of flow, we might say. Or, as we were talking a little bit earlier, it's like they actually have set aside the pressures that come along with the critical voice, come along with the way of existing in the world that always has outcome in its sights, and rather artists are embodying that process, falling in love with the act of creativity itself, embracing their way of working, embracing the working on the work. Then we move into advice to artists. I know 2 golden rules of ethics, which are no less golden in composition than in life. Number 1, know thyself. Number 2, reverence thyself. Be true if you would be believed. Truth, there can be no merit, no craft at all without that. And further, all beauty is, in the long run, only fineness of truth, or what we call expression, the finer accommodation of speech to that vision within. And I think that culturally we're having a complicated moment with truth. There's a way in which, now is the time for an overshare. I grew up in the Mormon church, and the Mormon church has a keen obsession with this word truth. The way that word finds its way into a kind of jargon or vernacular, and in growing up, it's like I embraced the notion of truth, but then it was that very notion that pushed me out of the church as I started to discover the kind of complicated history of the church. So it's this weird, this weird tension between the kind of axiom of the church itself, I know this church is true, they always say, and the very real problems that are there to be discovered in the history of the church. So how does one confront that? That confrontation threw me into a space where everything became a kind of epistemic conundrum. How do I know what I know? And that question, I think, largely steered me toward my choice to become, or to try and live a creative life, to try to become and learn to call myself an artist, and to be an artist. And I think that in some ways, we now hear the notion of that we live in a post-truth society. And in some ways, I kind of feel like the culture has just arrived at that epistemic conundrum through other means, of course, through the means of YouTube and social media and social networking. But we found, the annihilation or the ousting of, the expert, the people who profess the truth. The sense of that truth has just become slippery. So I've really liked people who take that on directly, and I like works of art that try and take that on directly, that we start to see and honor that discursive space that, that we are existing in, the way in which works of art, descriptions of states of being, descriptions of states of soul, possibilities for human expression, human experience, human interaction, and then the way that these things are put in tension with other bubbles of being, that we're in this back and forth, between knowing and unknowing, as we try and find, a purpose for our purpose-driven lives. But here is the advice. The logical terminus of a series already quoted. Oh, let me go back then. Hausmann's little book to the poetic mind yields this illustration. Having drunk a pint of beer at luncheon, beer is a sedative to the brain, and my afternoons are the least intellectual portion of my life. I would go out for a walk or two of 2 or 3 hours. As I went along, thinking of nothing in particular, only looking at things around me and following the progress of the seasons, there would flow into my mind with sudden and unaccountable emotion, sometimes a line or two of verse, sometimes a whole stanza at once. Here is a confession of how poems were written, which would do as a definition of poetry just as well as an emotion recollected in tranquility, and which the young poet might equally well take to heart as a practical rule. Drink a pint of beer, relax, go walking, think on nothing in particular, look at things, surrender yourself to yourself, search for the truth in your own soul, listen to the sound of your own inside voice, discover and express. It's probably true that all this is excellent advice for poets. All this, however, would appear to belong to an art separate from criticism, to a psychological discipline, a system of self-development, a yoga, which the young poet perhaps does well to notice, but which is something different from the public art of evaluating poems. I think that's where I want to stop today. End it with that key point of advice, which we might say is relax, go for it. Slow down. Go for a walk. Let go of the parameters and the expectations that we hold over ourselves and go and discover what there is in the world. Find yourself in your work. Allow yourself to find yourself in your work. All right. That's the best I can do today. But I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of Throwing Your Toys Away.